everyone to our community Bible study. This is our 7th Profile in Faith, where we're continuing the story of Joseph. You remember Joseph was one of the 12 sons of Jacob, who was renamed Israel. And Joseph was not very well favored. He was favored by his father and mother, but not by his brothers. And he had dreams and he interpreted them that he was going to rule over his brothers. So they almost killed him and ended up selling him as a slave to traders to Egypt. So now we realize that Joseph goes to Egypt. He ends up serving in the home of an official until he is accused of molesting the woman, even though he did not do that. It ends up in prison. And so he's been there, and now we're going to take it up on chapter 41 through 50 and learn how Joseph saved not only his family, the people of Israel, but also many of the people in Egypt. So here we go, chapter 41. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. Pharaoh was troubled with this dream. His wise men could not interpret it. And the chief cupbearer, who 2 years before had been in prison and Joseph had interpreted his dream, finally remembers about this guy Joseph. And so Pharaoh, verse 14, Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, no telling what he looked like after living in the dungeon, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Then Joseph said, I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer that he desires. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, here's the dream. In my dream, I was standing on the bank of the Nile. When up out of the river, there came 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 more cows came up, scrawny, very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came first. But even after they ate them, no one could tell they had done so. They looked just as ugly as before. And then I woke up. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk, very healthy. After then, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me. Then Joseph answered to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It's one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are also 7 years, along with the 7 worthless heads of grain. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. Verse 33. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the years of abundance. They should collect all the food these good years that are coming, store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the whole country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. Well, the plan seemed like a good one to Pharaoh and to his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." What a turnaround. It's amazing that Pharaoh would trust Joseph, but it was, and we don't know what time frame this might have been. This is written as if it were one conversation at one point in time. It might have been a little bit longer before he decided, but it is clear that Pharaoh sees that Joseph has the insight and capability to take this plan and make it happen. And besides, this is God's plan, and the players are playing their parts in the plan that God has. So now, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Pharaoh says, "I put you in the whole land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. That's the sign of authority. Whether you use the ring to put a seal on documents or it's just the sign, but that's the sign of that this person has authority. Pharaoh dressed Joseph in robes of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people would shout before him, "Make way." Thus, Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Pharaoh even said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift hand or foot in all of Egypt." Pharaoh gave him the name Japhenath-Paneah, something like that, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. To talk about going throughout means he can travel freely. He is in charge. Everyone followed what Joseph said. Verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance, stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Again, God providing the abundance. Verse 50, before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." Well, he predicted it, and verse 53 tells that the 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end. And the 7 years of famine began just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands too, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. And Pharaoh told the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. Go and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the whole country. And all the world around them came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. Well, chapter 42 brings us back to Joseph's family, original family, even though he's kind of become this important person in Egypt. And we learn about them and them having to come to Egypt. So chapter 42. When Jacob, Joseph's father, back in Israel, learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his son, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" I love that touch. That sounds like a father. Come on, guys, get it together. Jacob continued, "I have heard there's grain in Egypt, so go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. Jacob did not send Benjamin, who was Joseph's brother, with the others because he was afraid of the harm that might come to him. Remember, Benjamin and Joseph were the two sons he had from Rachel, who was his love. And for him to have lost one, he couldn't bear the thought of anything happening. So as you can imagine, this grieving father, even years later, is holding on as tightly as he can to his son Benjamin, who has now become the favorite, I'm sure. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, along with people from other lands, for there was a famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor in Egypt, the person who sold the grain to everyone. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered, "your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man, who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Well, we're dealing here with what is Joseph going to do as he responds to them. The issue is resentment, bitterness, a hard heart, versus the willingness to forgive those in spite of what happens. And you see Joseph's first reaction is, first of all, I'm not telling them, they don't know who I am, I'm going to keep it to myself. And then he remembers what they did, and he thinks about that, and he is accusing them of being spies. And he is going to give them as hard a time as he can. The whole idea, what it must be like to carry a resentment and a burden like Joseph is beyond what I would say that I know. But I do know that it is difficult to let go when one has been hurt. And if you don't get a chance to resolve it over the years, that can just become worse and worse, and resentment, and you want to do revenge and all kinds of things that happen. But here is this story, and if you read carefully, and we're skipping verses in and out of here as there are things that are repetitive. But Joseph is struggling with, how does he respond? Does he help save his father and brothers? Or does he make them pay for this? We'll find out. So verse 17, Joseph puts them all in custody for 3 days. So they are arrested for 3 days. And I'm sure they thought they had made a big mistake going to Egypt. But on the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back to your starving households. But when you return, you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and you may not die." Thus they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we're being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life years ago, but we would not listen. And that is why this distress has come on us." So they are thinking about, well, we are now paying for what happened before. Reuben, if you remember, he was one who tried to be more reasonable. Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen. Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. So you see, Joseph was speaking, of course, the language of Egypt, which would have been different than the language of those in Canaan, the Hebrew. So Joseph was continuing to play the role of the life that he was living, and not revealing. However, on verse 24, Joseph turned away from them and began to weep. See, God's tugging at his heart. And then he came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to put each man's silver back in the sack. That was what they were going to buy the grain with. And gave them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. Joseph made it clear that they had to fear him. And yet he also was being touched by what was going on. So they all went back. 29, they came back to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. I don't know how long the trip would be. I'm going to say a number of days by foot. And they told him all that had happened to them. So we skip down to verse 36. Their father Jacob said to them, he's still grieving, losing Joseph. "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more," because he's the one in prison in Egypt. "And now you want to take Benjamin? Everything is against me." And he is distraught.